Welcome to the Annual International Studies Convention 2013. I just want to briefly speak about the convention for 2 seconds and invite my dean to give you a proper welcome while you're settling down. This is a convention supported by the Public Diplomacy Division and the ICSSR. We also have several university partners and also the IDSA. Let me start this inaugural session by requesting the Dean, Professor Girijesh Pant, Dean of SIS and Convener and Chair of the Steering Committee of AISC, to give you the welcome remarks.
Honorable Minister of External Affairs, Shri Salman Khurshid Ji, Vice Chancellor Professor Sapuri, Professor Amitav Acharya, key speaker of the session, dignitaries in the audience, distinguished diplomats, faculty members, delegates, and students. It's indeed a privilege for us in the School of International Studies to welcome you all to the convention AISC 2013. That is Annual International Studies Convention 2013. The idea of this convention is basically to provide a platform to researchers, scholars, and policymakers, in fact the community engaged in the studies across the countries, to converse on emerging issues in the domain of IR and area studies collectively. The vision is to create a democratic atmospheric, a space to promote informed and vibrant debate on issues of strategic concerns and explores new areas of research. It also has an outreach dimension to promote awareness and sensitization on issues that impinge on our foreign policy making, especially in the context of emerging divergences in the perception and position between the state and the central government. The theme of the convention, as you know, is reimagining global order, not world order. It is not just a replacement of word, but a recognition of new coordinates, of appreciation that the world is transforming into globe, that the boundaries are losing their glamour, privileging of the nation and the state as a unit of analysis in IR and area studies, though relevant, but certainly is not adequate. The emergence of non-state players of global scale, the global corporates, the global NGOs, ethnic groups, religious institutions, the terror groups, and their instant communication, networking, and mobility is changing the nature of engagement, making its comprehension much more complex. In the emerging hyper-communicative global, the voice from the street is becoming louder. The street too is globalizing. The connect between Tahrir Square to We Are the 99 to Jantar Mantar illustrates it. The point made here is to underline that there is a thrust for representation. The domestic is spilling over to global. There is a unique sense of betweenness that is being felt. The strangeness seems to be melting down as the experiences are becoming common, and so are the cause. However, the voice from the margin or south is more of protest than of articulating the alternative. For instance, across the continent of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, despite the crisis of neoliberal policies, the attempts are made more for course correction than defining alternatives. The challenge before South becomes much more fundamental and substantial because of its being increasingly becoming part of the global. The global South, as it is called, and the concept paper observe, has to not just remain revisiting the existing debates and issues, but also reconceptualizing and reimagining them. It needs reimagining because global South is no more geography of mines and minerals. it is emerging as a critical part of the global production network, global value chain, and global knowledge order. But this global order is hierarchical too. It needs no elaboration that the hierarchy has a power connotation. The challenge before the global south thus is to be part of the global, yet to deconstruct and contest the hierarchy, pushing a global agenda for equitable and sustainable order. This certainly changes the binary of north and south, or developed and developing. Obviously, there has been sea change in the way we have been understanding the dynamics of international relation area studies. While the nation state may remain the unit of study, but the framework of analysis has to become global. That provides the rationale and a case for reimagining global order in plural. It is our expectation that the deliberation in the convention will address and articulate to these concerns. Minister Sir, may I bring to your kind attention that the convention is organized in the partnership with the 6 leading universities, namely Central University of Hyderabad, Central University Gujarat, Punjab University, Calcutta University, Central University Pondicherry, Pune University, and Institute of Defence Studies and Analysis. Perhaps the first collaborative venture of its kind, we believe it could be trendsetter. The response has been very encouraging. Nearly more than 600 abstracts were submitted. These abstracts were peer-reviewed, and finally 300, to be more precise 298, are selected for presentation in this convention. These 300 presentations will be spread over 8 parallel sessions, making total 72 technical sessions. These technical sessions will be running in parallel. Besides this, we have a 6 plenary and 8 roundtables and workshop. The efforts of this scale has just not been possible but the kind of support we got from the Public Diplomacy Division of Ministry of External Affairs and the ICSSR. We will have a last session where we will be officially acknowledging the thanks to these organizations and to other colleagues. Permit me to say that I will not feel happy if I don't record at this moment the kind of hard work done by my colleague and the students in making this event success. Sir, we are very confident with your word of blessings. This convention is going to be a great success and could be a new chapter in terms of networking and collaboration among the universities and the think tanks who are engaged in the area of international relation area studies, and thereby empowering a rise of a new community on the horizon of Indian academic map. With these words, once again I welcome you all, and we are indeed grateful to you, sir, that despite your busy schedule, we know about it, the Parliament is on, yet you accepted our request, spare some time, and we look forward to your words of wisdom. Thank you very much.
May I now request our Vice Chancellor, Professor Sudeep Kumar Sopuri, to make his address.
Honorable Minister of External Affairs, Shri Salman Khurshid ji, Professor Amitav Acharya from American University, Washington, is also GNU alumnus, Professor Gajesh Pant, Dean SIS, Professor Murthy, distinguished speakers, participants, faculty, students. On behalf of Jawaharlal Nehru University and on my own behalf, I extend you a warm welcome to the annual International Studies Convention 2013, which is going to discuss issues related to global order, reimagining global order. And this is being organized by School of International Studies, which has its own reputation in collaboration, as was mentioned, with 6 other universities and 1 institute. This is one of the largest meetings that we have organized in recent past. And the trendsetter, as the Dean said, is that this is being done in collaboration with other universities. On this occasion, I'm especially thankful to Shri Salman Khurshid Sahib to accept our invitation to be with us on this inauguration of this important meeting. And I'm also thankful to Professor Acharya to have agreed to deliver the keynote address. As an outsider, being a scientist not associated with any of the activities which are going to be discussed here, I feel that this meeting is timely, appropriate and important, and we need at this stage to debate on how to deal with big issues of global challenges with global governance, especially as the title of this meeting is From the South Perspective. With rapid communication systems, which has brought people on this planet closer, and information that is now accessible on real-time basis, easy movement of people across continents for education, business and work, which also results in mix-up of population in different nations, global sharing of technology and knowledge. And because of these issues, during the last 4 to 5 decades, we see that the world is becoming more and more global. Development and globalization has also brought us face to face with many common challenges. Global climate change, which is not restricted due to geographical boundaries, nuclear proliferation, poverty and hunger in developing countries, regional conflicts which need resolutions to usher in peace and stability, multilateral trade, global financial crises affecting world economies, terrorism that understands no international norms, cyber wars, issues of energy, urbanization, and many others. Now, to attend to these issues, we need models, newer models of global governance. It's not that we do not have any models existing as of now. We have the formal multilateral institutions like United Nations, IAEA, FAO, and many other such organizations. But looks like an organization like United Nations has not evolved with changing world order. We still have only 4 or 5 members of this, the main members. There are other informal global governance forums like G8, which also have lacked adequate representation, especially from South. Thus, many people think it lacks legitimate authority. There are other forums, like we talk about BRICS, regional forums like SAARC, etc., which are important in their own context. However, we think that it's time that we reimagine new global orders that will be more representative and would meet the expectation and aspirations of each country and region. Mr. Paul Martin, when he was the Prime Minister of Canada, launched these debates and called for the creation of what he called L20 or later on G20. His model wasn't accepted by many. It was debated at different forums in different parts of the world. I was going through some of these articles which have been published, many of you would know because you are in this field, which have been published in great details in a journal called Global Governance a few years back. That was something around 2007, 2008. The fact is, the world political and economical scenario is under constant change as new regional economical powers are emerging. It is therefore essential that we discuss and relook at many of these global governance structures. We need efficient, inclusive, and more representative structures that support policies befitting or benefiting all with responsibilities and which can bring about ecological and economical equilibrium and usher in developmental models that are sustainable. Though one is striving for global orders to find acceptable and adaptable solutions, we know that state orders will not vanish or disintegrate. We'll still have bilateral relationships, we'll have regional alliances which will continue. Possibly the role of some of these, we hope, will change, and the scope of governance at the nation level, nation or state levels or regional levels, will also change. Now, whether these forces of change will transform or support major world orders, one need to see that. Now, with so many experts in this convention who were assembled here, I'm sure that deliberations of this meeting will turn out to be good academic exercise. But besides that, I hope that it will also come out with a menu of new ideas and solutions of global governance from the perspective of South. I wish this meeting all success. Thank you very much.
May I now request the inaugural address by our chief guest, Sri Salman Khurshid, External Affairs Minister, Government of India, to make his remarks.
Good morning. I'm absolutely honored to be here for one of my favorite universities, and I think that it's very comforting to be inside a university when the world outside looks a bit topsy-turvy. I'm absolutely greatly honored to have here the Vice Chancellor, Professor Supuri, and of course Professor Amitabh Acharya, Professor C.S.R. Murthy, Professor Gritesh Pant, who just addressed us, and of course very distinguished ladies and gentlemen. I think reimagining global orders, perspectives from the South, it's such a vast subject that I would really be anxiously waiting to hear what Professor Amitabh Acharya has to say in his keynote lecture. And I say this because as we try to reimagine our relationships from the South with the North, and in the global context, important constant reminders to us are about what is happening within our respective societies. If you look at the Arab Spring, you look at the Wall Street, Occupy Wall Street, you look at the Greenpeace movement, even though they've institutionalized into the Green parties now in Europe, but on the cutting edges, the Greenpeace movement and its clash with established order, and as indeed has been suggested by Professor Gritesh Pant, also similar echoes in our own country. How far this will go and where it will take us, I think still remains a major imponderable for all of us. I've just been in Bahrain last night, and Bahrain was at the receiving end of a major conflict, not only in terms of the pluralistic changes that are being demanded in the Arab Spring movement elsewhere, but also the unfortunate and unwholesome divisions that we see now growing in different parts of the world, including our own country, which are in some form sectarian divisions, things that we had all hoped that we had seen the last of. But unfortunately, they seem to have perhaps the last spurt, after which hopefully they will die. But anyway, I'm absolutely delighted that I can be here at this university, which we think of as a hub of intellectual ferment and cutting-edge ideas, which we expect and hope will continue to shape the intellectual landscape of our country, and that we are able to combine with you as an experiment or in partnership with our public diplomacy division, that we are able to combine with you for this international relations exercise at this convention is a great honor indeed. And I hope that the process of the interface and interaction that is taking place here, we will be able to come to grips with in a better way with the living world that is changing rapidly, and where we need to, I imagine, question existing categories and binaries on one hand, as well as look at new ideas that will replace some cherished assumptions, perhaps value systems, or indeed find ways of fortifying them. So conceptual orthodoxies are increasingly being seen as inadequate in comprehending the remarkable changes that are coming to the surface in the 21st century and the constant flux and restlessness that we all feel. But as this happens, we see also in the larger scale, we see shifts of power from the north to the south, from the west to the east, and certainly in general from the establishment of the West to a much larger, what's been described by many of you as the West. That this rest is largely located in what's called the global South. This is an inescapable phenomena, and therefore, of course, necessitates for all of us in the South and the North reformulation of concepts and theoretical frameworks that have helped us perceive the world for many years, but that now require important changes. And I think this is reflected in the 2013 United Nations Development Programme report, which is entitled "The Rise of the South: Human Progress in a Diverse World." According to this report, if I quote, "For the first time in 150 years, the combined output of the developing world's three leading economies, that's Brazil, China, and India, is about equal to the combined GDP of the long-standing industrial powers of the North. That's Canada, France, Germany, Italy, the UK, and the US, which is 6 of the G7." Unquote. So, in addition to all this, we see, of course, growth and progress in economic terms and in terms of vital human development indices like education, health, infrastructure, in a much more varied and widespread, dispersed manner in the South. The UN report documents in detail about 40 countries of the South that have made perceptible gains in terms of human development indicators between 1990 and 2012. Obviously, India is an important part of that. Having said that, of course, as a footnote, I would say that there is a lot more that India still needs to do. We have perhaps the worst kind of contradiction anywhere in the world, where we have sophisticated, cutting-edge technology, the best expertise, the best professional institutions, and outstanding human talent at one end, and some really regressive and sad degradation of opportunities because of inability to move fast enough and to open up and empower people without whose empowerment India cannot but slow down. The other thing that the report that I just mentioned notes is the emergence of something that's familiar to us, the ambitious, enterprising, and aspirational middle class across the global South. And of course, the economies of the South, with all the attendant problems of poverty, equality, host of development crises, is a fact now to reckon with, and the world recognizes this. South has real economic muscle and financial capacity. More than 3/4 of the assets in the sovereign wealth funds worldwide are vested in countries who constitute the rest. But of course, that is again a small portion of the countries that form the rest. Thirdly, the report maps out the reconfiguration and reemergence of South-South cooperation, which we have been advocating in the context of incremental accretion of economic power in the Southern Hemisphere. According to the report, South-South economic engagement, including investment, finance, technology transfer, and trade, registered a dramatic surge from 8.1% in 1990 to 26.7% of the total world trade. And I think perhaps I may not be wrong in saying that it is this recognition that would have finally tilted the scales at Bali. For India, the rise of the rest is a moment of special pride. And I think if we just reflect back on the name of the person after whom your university is named, our first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, who's a true internationalist and a driving force behind the non-aligned movement and the Afro-Asian solidarity of the 1950s and 1960s, that see in another form this come to fruition is something that we can certainly celebrate in tribute to Jawaharlal Nehru. And of course, we saw this and we anticipated this and put in place instruments like the Indian Technical and Economic Assistance Program, better known by the acronym of ITEC. 1964 is when we launched it. The underlying ethos of ITEC in India's Development Assistance Program has been to pursue our national development agenda while sharing knowledge and skills with fellow developing countries in a true spirit of partnership. It was not exceptionalism India was seeking, but the spirit of solidarity, empathy, and connectedness with the larger developing world that shone through in those early outreach efforts towards our index South countries. And it was in this spirit of sharing and co-creating that we have continued and animated our multifarious development assistance programs, even as it has grown larger than one had ever imagined. With last year reached around 9,000 civilians from 161 countries attending training courses in the entire spectrum of disciplines under the auspices of ITEC, conducted in 47 Indian institutions. We offer 2,300 scholarships annually for degree courses at universities, including yours. Africa, which is the main focus of this, our policy has been framed by the trinity of training, technology transfer, and capacity building. At the two India-Africa Forum Summits in 2008-2011, we pledged to set up over 100 institutions spanning diverse areas at the continental, regional, and bilateral levels, and promise training institutions are on the verge of becoming a reality as we prepare to host the third India-Africa Forum Summit in New Delhi next year. Part of this ambitious program is a Pan-African e-network, which is bringing benefits of telemedicine and teleeducation to far-flung corners in 40 countries in Africa, and I do hope that we will ramp it up to become to have even a larger footprint. It's a miracle of technology that someone suffering from a complicated heart condition in a village in Africa can now get consultancy via the satellite network from one of the best doctors sitting thousands of miles away in India in some super specialty hospital in Delhi, Chennai, or Mumbai. The other example that comes to mind as part of this landscape is what we call the solar grandmothers. Now, this is a program in which illiterate and semi-literate women from remote villages of Africa, Latin America, and the Pacific Islands are taught solar engineering skills in a small village called Tilonia that you're all familiar with in Rajasthan. They come to India as grandmothers without any definable vocation, and they return home as virtual heroes, lighting up their far-flung villages in Senegal, Sierra Leone, Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, Kiribati, Nauru, El Salvador, Haiti, Zanzibar, Sudan, etc. Similarly, Afghanistan, closer home, we've launched dozens of grassroots development programs as part of our systems. While others provide them military hardware, we provide them partnership in development, and it's now pegged almost at $2 billion in assistance. This issue really brings me to the concept of a discourse on southern donors, a concept or a description that we contest, because this emerges from the constructs of North-South engagement. But the fact is that there has been a perceptible escalation of development assistance and aid, soft loans, flowing from developing countries to other developing countries, as indeed we do. In the last decade or so, India has dispersed over 150 lines of credit, amounting to $10 billion for a wide array of projects, from drinking water schemes to power plants to technology parks, railway infrastructure in developing countries like Africa, Central Asia, Latin America, and elsewhere. And India has pledged about $6 billion in lines of credit to Africa alone. This has substantially expanded its development cooperation portfolio through grant assistance to countries on the periphery like Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, Maldives, Myanmar, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. And what do we have here? Projects in infrastructure, hydroelectricity, power transmission, and transport. So the principles that differentiate this kind of cooperation, South-South cooperation, from a North-South cooperation paradigm is important to reflect upon. India's approach, which reflects the South-South paradigm, is demand-driven. In all these projects are undertaken at the request of the host countries. The development priorities of partner countries as articulated by them forms the guiding principle and philosophy. Secondly, we are not prescriptive. That is, development assistance is not linked with conditionalities. Thirdly, there is no intrusive agenda behind this development assistance. That is, we do not challenge national sovereignty and ask for structural adjustments, as in the case of North-South donor-recipient relationships. Fourthly, the assistance of developing countries to fellow developing countries is wholly voluntary and not underpinned by notions of historic responsibility, as is the case with North-South cooperation. This point needs to be emphasized. It is often underplayed in the contemporary discourse on global aid architecture, as South-South cooperation is devoid of externally imposed norms drawn from the North-South cooperation. But of course, we know that South-South cooperation is not a substitute for North-South cooperation, given the continued economic primacy of the North. It can only supplement North-South cooperation, and therefore it is logical that the North-South engagement leads the aid process as we move towards defining the post-2015 development agenda, and this must not be lost sight of. Against this backdrop, let us return to the presiding theme of the convention, which is reimagining world orders, perspectives from the South, and summarize important factors that, in my view, would shape the reimagination of the world. I just would add, I was at the Manama dialogue last 2 days, and there was a constant refrain of asking whether a drawdown of United States of America from the Middle East, or what we have been calling West Asia, would require a country like India to fill the gaps the vacuum left by retreating American forces. Of course, the United States of America has emphasized over and over again that it has no intention to retreat, that it continues to see itself in a role of providing security and strategic balance in that part, indeed other parts of the globe as well. But it's important to think of the expectations of the emerging profile of India in the world, and India's own philosophical constraints. India not willing to play the role of a global power in the manner in which others have conceived that role for themselves, but to play it in a different manner of close interaction, capacity building, helping institutions to grow, and ultimately, of course, hoping that self-reliance assisted by friends' development partnership would be the best possible way of every country addressing its destiny. So let us then, first and foremost, look at the cutting across the North-South divide. We are all engaged in negotiating an equitable, inclusive, and balanced world order, which is where as the Vice Chancellor just said, United Nations begins to look in dire need for reform. And this would enable all nation states in an interconnected world to effectively grapple with a host of cross-cutting security and development challenges. Exceptionalization and isolationism are hardly viable options. Intense and sustained global cooperation is required to deal with a range of security challenges, including terrorism, extremism, maritime piracy, cyber threats, disasters, and pandemics. On the development side, we need multi-pronged global collaborative networks to address pressing challenges like poverty, global warming, and sustainable development. In negotiating solutions to these challenges, the perspectives from the South will and must play a vital role. Secondly, in terms of discourse building, the North, with its powerful think tanks, universities, decades of strategic culture, continue to dominate. The South has to match its economic prowess with more virile discourse making of the South by the South. And I think this is, in a sense, being addressed at this convention. Thirdly, and perhaps most important, the perspectives of the South can achieve fruition only when the world order is substantially restructured to reflect those power shifts, and this is where really the outdated 1945 model of the United Nations and the UN Security Council calls for an urgent upgrade and an urgent reform. Fourthly, the adversarial interplay between global North and global South needs to be replaced by an engaged interaction and synthesis. But this is something that we can say for our own respective societies, where discourse has been degraded to a virtual slanging match all the time. And I think we owe it to succeeding generations that we get the discourse back to semblance of sanity, sympathy, and the best in form of communicative strategies that I think we can draw upon the likes of Mahatma Gandhi to move forward. The global South can't go on playing the role of the world's opposition. I think we need to realize this. But will have to proactively assert its credentials as a responsible stakeholder in the management of global commons. The study of the role of opposition, I think, is something in which India can be a major contributor. Above all, in reimagining the world order, the theorists and practitioners of international relations have to push the envelope and think out of the box to help give birth to a new world order which is reflective of the philosophy of the world as a family. And I do hope that, drawing upon vast Indian intellect, we would be able to provide the lead in conferences like this one against parochialism, bloc-based politicking, etc. The rapidly globalizing world has to think like one without diluting national and indigenous identities and cultures. This has been encapsulated in Vasudeva Kutumbakam, the ancient Vedic ideal of one world, one family, and there are comparative formulations in all religions and value systems that we can draw upon. In an international relations convention, reciting poetry may sound slightly jarring to purists, but nonetheless, I take this gamble as I firmly believe imagination can take us to a place where hard reasoning falters sometimes. Let me end with my favorite couplet from Omar Khayyam, and that's the message, really. I quote, "Our love, could thou and I with fate conspire to grasp this sorry scheme of things entire? Would not we shatter it to bits and then remold it nearer to the heart's desire," unquote. So I hope that the finest minds in our country that have gathered here today, particularly in international relations, will come out with some interesting, inspired ways of reimagining the world order. I wish you success in your discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for your inspiring message and your remarks. Before I invite our very special guest, Professor Amitav Acharya, I request our Vice Chancellor Professor Sopori to give a small memento and bouquet to our chief guest. May I now request our very special guest, Professor Amitav Acharya, UNESCO Chair in Transnational Challenges and Governance and Chair of the Asian Studies Center, American University, Washington, D.C., to deliver his keynote address to us, titled Imagining Global IR Out of India. Thank you.
Honorable Minister for External Affairs, His Excellency Salman Khurshid, Vice Chancellor of JNU, Professor Sopori, Dean of SIS, Gunijas Pant, Professor Pant, fellow participants, ladies and gentlemen. Allow me at the outset to thank the organizers for inviting me to the annual International Studies Convention 2013. I would have been very happy just to get an invitation to attend such a very special historic occasion. But to be asked to give the keynote speech is a special honor, especially when the host institution is my alma mater. This is a real privilege. Minister, one of the things that I took from your speech is that while there is a shift of power from the north to the south, it is yet to be reflected in the shift in intellectual, ideational power from the north to the south. And that is really the challenge for our discipline. Minister, you might be a little disappointed in some of what I have to say. It has no policy relevance. I actually speak as an academic, although in the later part of my speech, I will try to make some extrapolation of how this idea of a new universalism in IR might resonate with the Indian tradition. The theme of this convention, Reimagining Global Orders, Perspectives from the South, is very timely and important, but it's also very challenging. This is because there is very little agreement about what the future holds at this point. Pundits and policymakers have described the changing world order or global order in a variety of ways. Some say multipolar, some say polycentric, non-polar, apolar, neopolar, post-American, or G0. But all these labels are problematic. They are in the realm of speculation and invite controversy. But one thing is unmistakably clear. The so-called unipolar moment is over, at least very close to being over. What is more debatable is whether the American-led liberal hegemonic order, to quote Princeton academic John Eikenberry, whether that order is also going to wither away along with the unipolar moment. I am not talking about the decline of the United States as a power. That decline debate remains inconclusive and premature. It will be premature to say the United States is going to decline as the sole superpower of the world. But the order that the United States built since the Second World War is changing in fundamental ways. Some argue, including Professor Eikenberry and some American scholars and pundits, they believe that even if the United States declines itself, the order that it built, the liberal hegemonic order, is going to persist in some form. And it might even co-opt the challenges, countries like China, India, the BRICS. But as I argue in a forthcoming book, which will be released very soon, called The End of American World Order, that hope is mistaken. This is not because the new powers, the emerging powers of the world, have not benefited from the American-led order. But it is because they are not going to, just because they have benefited from their order, that they are going to want to keep it as it is without demanding and carrying out substantial changes. Because that order has been somewhat unjust, it has been marked by inequality, unilateralism, and exclusion of the rest. This is not to say that some features of the liberal order will not continue, such as the relatively open economies, multilateral institutions, and the advance of democracy. These features are not going to disappear. But the institutional structures, the leadership, and the management of the old order will change. The new order, the emerging order, is not going to be an American hegemony. Indeed, it will be no one's hegemony. Instead, we are going to see what I would call a multiplex world. Not a multipolar world, but a multiplex world, like a multiplex cinema. The term multiplex can be defined as a complex that houses several movie theaters. In a multiplex, there are several movies running in different screens within a single complex. Some of these movies are thrillers and westerns with violence, crime, ruggedness, and heroism as their prominent themes, such as the Hollywood type. Others would have passion, tragedy, song and dance, like the standard Bollywood fare, at least the old Bollywood fare. We would have kung fu films as produced in Hong Kong or Taiwan. We could have patriotic propaganda films as produced in mainland China since the Communist Revolution. There would be plenty of scope for independent films, what is called indie films, alongside films from the established houses like Columbia Pictures or Universal Studios. No single director or producer would monopolize the audience attention or loyalty. In a multiplex world, the audience will have a choice of service. The audience can watch or compare several movies at the same time. In reimagining global order today, we are shifting from watching movies in a conventional single-screen theater to a multiplex. The liberal hegemony idea or story is like watching one movie at a time in one theater. After the run of the British, the American movie has been showing for a while, at least for the last 60-odd years. That movie was scripted, produced, and directed by the United States, with itself as the lead actor. In a multiplex world, the American show is going to be joined by a variety of plays with different plots, producers, directors, and actors. The management of order will be more diversified and decentralized, with the involvement of established and emerging powers, middle powers, global and regional institutions, corporations, and transnational non-state actors. Some of them will be heroes, such as non-entrepreneurs promoting human rights and environmental protection. Some of them will be villains, such as Al-Qaeda, drug lords, people smugglers, and greedy corporations. In a multiplex world, there will be hits and flops, like some of the emerging powers, currently so hyped. They may fade away, some of them, because of the middle income trap, because of domestic instability, or hangover from regional conflicts. India, China, Russia, Brazil, all face such risks. The American show may continue to dominate the box office for a while, but the audience might lose interest if it gets a choice. Leadership in a multiplex world is plural and it's conducted in different styles and modes. But being under a multiplex also means sharing a common architecture and being in an interdependent relationship. Security screening in multiplex theaters, for example, is done at the entrance to the entire complex, implying collective and common security mechanisms at play. Now, what does this idea or metaphor, it's not a theory but a metaphor of a multiplex world, mean for international studies and international relations in India? And I should qualify that I'm using international studies and international relations almost interchangeably here. mindful of the distinction that international studies is a broader term and stresses the importance of area studies. Now let me tell you how a multiplex world might work in the case of Indian international relations, but also international relations as a discipline. There has been a lot of discussion of the state of international relations in India lately, especially at this institution in JNU. There was a special issue of international studies in 2009, and it's I invite all of you, those of you who haven't read it, to read it. One contributor to that debate, Professor Kanti Bajpai, the former professor at this university, argues that India led the developing world, certainly Asia, in international relations studies from 1947 to late 1980s. But since then, it has lost ground to China, Korea, and Japan. And he lists several obstacles to the advancement of international relations in India, including the neglect of theory, the failure to define a series of animating puzzles, problematics, and problem-solving agendas, the lack of methodological training, the quality of teaching, and the mismanagement of professional life. Another JNU professor, Amitabh Mattu, is even more scathing on the state of Indian IR. In his view, while, and I quote, there have been, of course, and continue to be, islands of excellence and inspiration, but these are overwhelmed by mediocrity that seems to define the discipline as it exists today, unquote. While Bajpai finds the reasons for the stagnation of Indian IR in problems peculiar to the discipline and its scholars, Mattu's diagnosis has more to do with institutional factors that plague Indian higher education system as a whole. As with the causes of stagnation or decline of Indian IR, there has been plenty of discussion about the remedies. Some remedies are institutional and relate to providing more resources and funding, and I was just told that the Ministry of External Affairs has provided 25 lakhs of rupees to finance this convention. Well, that's part of the solution, but not the entire solution. Other solutions call for intellectual and conceptual advances and shifts. Some of these suggested remedies stress the need for Indian IR community to take a greater interest in theoretical work. A T.V. Paul, who is also an alumni of JNU, was my classmate, now at McGill University in Montreal, suggests the need for rigorous theory-driven and theory-informed scholarship. Navnita Behera from Delhi University has explored a number of specific classical and contemporary sources of theory development. Siddharth Mallapurapu, who is also a faculty member here, has encouraged Indian scholars to build on existing paradigms and develop critical ones. I believe the causes of the underdevelopment of Indian IR and the ways to redress them have been sufficiently well discussed by others to require further elaboration. But what we don't have yet, what we do need, is a sense of what sort of overarching direction the field of IR in India or elsewhere should take. Here I do have a suggestion, drawing upon the theme of my presidency of the International Studies Association, which starts in 3 months. I call it Global IR. Let me tell you what I mean by Global IR. In a project launched almost a decade ago, a group of scholars, myself included, addressed the question, why is there no known non-Western IR theory or international relations theory? 3 aspects of this project, 3 elements or 3 findings of that project are very relevant to the theme of this convention today. First, the project argued that the main theories and concepts of international relations are too deeply rooted and beholden to the history, intellectual tradition, and agency claims of the West to accord more than a marginal place to those of the non-Western world. Second, it explored the reasons for the underdevelopment of international relations outside the West. These included cultural, political, institutional factors when viewed against the hegemonic status of Western international relations studies. And Professor Matthew, Professor Bajpai, and others in the special issue of international studies explored those reasons quite well. Third, the project identified some of the possible sources of building a non-Western international relations. including indigenous history and culture, the idea of nationalist leaders, distinctive local and regional interaction patterns, and the writings of scholars of distinction in and about different regions. The naming, if not the intent or substance of this non-Western IR theory approach has caused some controversy. Some would like to call it post-Western rather than non-Western. I have come to view the new project as part of a both inclusive of both non-Western and post-Western, as part of a broader challenge of reimagining IR as a global project. And this is the substance of global IR. It is obvious that in using the term global IR, I'm not calling for renaming the discipline. So much for so long has been written of and about international relations and international studies that it has now become a heritage site that deserves to be preserved. But global IR is not the same as traditional IR that we know. Broadly stated, the idea of a global IR has 6 main dimensions. First, it is inclusive. It calls for international relations to be more authentically grounded in world history and not Western history, and in the ideas, institutions, intellectual perspectives, and practices of both Western and non-Western societies. Second, global IR subsumes rather than supplants the existing Western-dominated international relations. You would know this when it comes to dealing with the non-Western world, international relations is not a monolith or unchanging. For example, constructivism, a relatively new theory of international relations, has been especially important in opening space for scholarship on the non-Western world because of its trace on culture and identity. New variants of realism, such as subaltern realism, neoclassical realism, defensive realism, have rendered realism more relevant to the non-Western world. Increasing trends towards economic interdependence, multilateral institutions, and democratization, which are pathways to global order that liberalism identifies and prescribes, has rendered that theory more relevant to the non-Western world. At the same time, the global IR approach doesn't leave these mainstream theories as is. Instead, it urges them to rethink their assumptions and extend their horizons. For realism, the challenge is to look beyond national interest and the distribution of power. For liberalism, the challenge is to look beyond American hegemony as the starting point of investigating multilateralism and regionalism and their institutional forms. Liberalism also needs to acknowledge the significant variations in cooperative behavior that exist in different regional contexts, and that no single model of regional integration or interactions can account for all or most of them. For constructivism, acknowledging different forms of agency in the creation and diffusion of ideas and norms is a major but unrealized challenge as yet. Third, the global IR designation doesn't mean we should ignore regions, the importance of regions and regionalisms. In fact, global IR gives center stage to regions. While the world is not being fragmented into regions or regional blocks, it is also not moving inexorably towards a seamless globality. A global IR approach calls for the acknowledgement of regional diversity and agency. Regions are no longer viewed in material terms as fixed geographic entities, but as dynamic, purposeful, and socially constructed spaces. Regionalism today is less territorially based or state-centric and encompasses an ever-widening range of actors and issues. The traditional divide between regionalism and universalism may be breaking down. The study of regions is not just about how regions self-organize their economic, political, and cultural space, but also how they resonate and relate to the physical and ideational spaces of other regions and shape global order. Relatedly, the study of regions is central to forging a close integration between disciplinary approaches and area studies. Fourth, global IR calls for a new understanding of universalism or universality. The dominant meaning of universalism or universality is applying to all. One size fits all. It is the perspective of a homogeneous reality. This is the essence of the Enlightenment universalism, whose dark side was suppression of diversity and justification of European imperialism. Rejecting that, I accept Robert Cox's alternative understanding of universalism, which involves I quote, comprehending and respecting diversity in an ever-changing world, unquote. I call this syncretic universalism, and as I will argue soon, it blends very well with the Indian tradition. Fifth, a truly global IR cannot be based solely or mainly on cultural exceptionalism, and I think the minister referred to the term exceptionalism, or parochialism. Exceptionalism, the tendency to present the characteristics of a social group, a group of states, as homogeneous, collectively unique, and superior to those of others. Claims about exceptionalism in international relations are questionable, not just because the cultural and political diversity within nations and regions. Such claims are also frequently associated with the political agenda and purposes of a ruling elite, as evident in concepts such as Asian values, Asian human rights, Asian democracy, all of which are rightly associated with authoritarianism. Similarly, exceptionalism in IR can justify dominance of big powers over the weak. American exceptionalism, seemingly benign and very popular at home, is associated or can be associated with the Monroe Doctrine and the self-serving global interventionism of the United States. One strand of Japan's pre-war Pan-Asian discourse, which was founded upon the conception of Asia for Asians, illustrates this tendency as well. China's invoking of the tributary system is pregnant with similar possibilities, since the Pacific nature of the tributary system remains contested. While the development of a national school of IR can broaden and enrich the discipline, if based on exceptionalism mainly, it will challenge the idea or the possibility of a global IR. Finally, global IR takes a broad conception of agency. And here the minister might find some resonance between my theory and his practice. For a long time, international relations theory denied the agency of non-Western states. The non-Western states were considered as objects rather than subjects of international relations. This is not true just of realism, liberalism, or constructivism, the mainstream theories. It's also true of critical theories, including post-colonialism and dependency theories. Can the subaltern speak? Now, that was basically one of the rhetorics of the traditional post-colonial literature. I think the subaltern can speak, and it has spoken. It depends on what we mean by agency. Agency can be material as well as ideational. It can be exercised at the global level as well as regional and local levels. Agency can take multiple forms. It can describe acts of resistance to and localization of global norms and institutions. Agency also means constructing new rules and institutions to support and strengthen global order. Agency means conceptualizing and implementing new pathways to development, security, and ecological justice. Now, using that broader framework of agency, we can find that the South has a voice. To give some examples, Latin American states led the creation of global human rights norms. India and China were on the forefront of creating development norms at the Bretton Woods conferences. Sovereignty was redefined and broadened at the Asia-Africa conference in Bandung. Africa created a form of regionalism to maintain post-colonial boundaries. India's Jawaharlal Nehru was the first to propose a nuclear test ban. Some of these acts of agency are not just for regions or for the South, but also for global governance as a whole. From the climate change negotiations, we see examples of a common but differentiated responsibility. The idea of human development and the idea of human security were pioneered by South Asians, Mahbub-ul-Haq and Amartya Sen. The idea of responsibility to protect, usually attributed to a Canadian-inspired commission, actually had strong African lineage. It owes to the concept of responsible sovereignty attributed to an African diplomat, Francis Deng, who was generalizing from the African context. In sum, international relations as a multiple global heritage that must be acknowledged and promoted. The global IR perspective is inclusive in every sense and across the traditionally understood but increasingly blurred east-west, north-south lines. And it is this conception of global IR that I would propose for the Indian academic and policy community. Why? This brings me perhaps to my most controversial point today. We all know that India is an inclusive nation, democratic nation. What we don't care to admit that India doesn't have a very unique or exceptionalist culture. India is rich in tradition, history, ideas, and practices, which constitute a key source of global IR. At the same time, these ideas and institutions have proven to be highly exportable and compatible with cultures and norms of other societies and nations. Thanks to its geography, history, culture, a syncretic universalism thrives in India. India has received ideas and culture as much as it has given them to others. Indian ideas during the classical period found their way to Southeast Asia and Central Asia. A powerful example of syncretic universalism is Sufism, as anyone who has visited Dargah Nizamuddin in Old Delhi would know. And yesterday, after I landed in Delhi, I went there as my first visit because I know the pier. I brought a bunch of my students from American University to visit Nizamuddin 3 years ago, and my students are so impressed that they keep asking me to visit and keep asking me to take them back there. It is therefore not surprising that there is little movement towards an Indian school of IR, and I very much hope that it stays that way. This is in marked contrast to the growing demand for a Chinese school of international relations. The Chinese school is based on the Confucianism, Tianxia, the all under heaven concept, the tributary system, and other very distinctive elements of Chinese civilization, politics, and patterns of interaction with the outside world. These have some resonance with its neighborhood, but not much beyond. This makes the idea of a Chinese international relations school limited in its relevance. This is also one of the key limitations of Chinese power. While China is materially growing more powerful every day, it doesn't offer an exportable and attractive ideology for others to follow. What about India? Some argue that Indian international relations should develop by focusing on the rise of India, including the concerns and status that comes with it, just as the Chinese scholars are creating a Chinese school of IR by focusing on the so-called peaceful rise of China. While some of this is understandable and inevitable, pushing this as the central basis of reimagining Indian IR would be a terrible intellectual mistake. As with its history, Indian domestic politics and foreign policy resonates with universalistic norms. India has been a democracy, unlike China, since the Communist Party took over. There have been powerful voices in India against narrower forms of nationalism, which is a cousin of exceptionalism. Rabindranath Tagore was a leading example of this universalistic ethos. Most, though not all, of India's post-war leaders accepted values of political liberalism and security universalism. Nehru was developing world's most articulate critique of ideological blocs and a key defender of the UN and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Indian non-alignment has been interpreted as both realism and idealism at the same time. But what is often forgotten, that it could be shared with so many countries around the world. It proved to be highly exportable. If Indian foreign policy was truly exceptionalist, then it is unlikely that so many countries around the world would have accepted non-alignment. The Indian IR community should unabashedly embrace and promote this syncretic universalism. It is in this sense that India offers a potentially rich source of the development and advancement of global IR. The global IR approach is especially important in avoiding the trap of exceptionalism and parochialism as Indian IR community strives to overcome its hitherto limitations. And this is the central message I urge you to take from this convention. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Acharya, for your excellent and somewhat exceptional speech. I suppose even though you don't like the word exceptionalism, you won't take exception to that. I just thought I'll break this, constant speeches. I would like to request our Dean to give Professor Acharya a small memento from us and a bouquet of flowers. For the Vice Chancellor also. May I also request the Dean to give our very own Vice Chancellor a small memento and a bouquet of flowers as well. Thank you for your support, sir. May I now request Professor CSR Murthy from SIS, who is also our co-chair, steering committee of the AISC 2013, to give us the vote of thanks.
Honorable Minister, our Chief Guest, Vice Chancellor, and our Dean. It is indeed a moment of great pride and satisfaction to us all in the School of International Studies. Because for the simple reason that this event is truly unprecedented in its scale and importance, and possibly for its positive implications for the progressive development of the discipline of international relations in India. For this great event to be made possible, there are several quarters of support. In fact, this inaugural session has proved to be quite substantive in very many ways. Each one who had delivered address had touched upon several significant concerns that affect contemporary global order, especially from the perspective of the South. Foremost, I would like to acknowledge the insightful ideas, including those of co-sharing perspective coming from the Indian Minister for Foreign Affairs, Mr. Salman Khurshid, touching upon the distinctive concept of partnership in the development practice to the benefit of the developing countries, and also at the same time calling for addressing the adversarial relationships that exist between the North and South and redressing them not in equally adversarial but more constructive, accommodative terms. I am sure these concerns will echo in the deliberations of our session. Professor Amitabh Acharya has given us more than adequate food for thought by flagging several exciting ideas. For example, the multiplex. May I say, sir, that the physical setting of this very convention is an academic multiplex. I am sure our guests and delegates will enjoy 6 technical sessions simultaneously will be held, and the delegates will have ample opportunity of choice among the technical sessions. There are, and I'm grateful that you have touched upon with great concern the existing problems of underdevelopment of Indian IR, and also have ended up with some optimistic note about the possible contribution Indian IR, both in terms of academia and practitioners, could make to make IR truly global. We are grateful for the basket of ideas you have proposed. I'm sure the delegates and presenters will address them. Our Vice Chancellor has also touched upon, I'm grateful to you, sir, for referring to the initiatives like L20 and issues and challenges of global governance. Our Vice Chancellor, right from the beginning, has been a great source of strength and support. In fact, there were many occasions where we have turned to him for solutions, and solutions were offered and implemented in a jiffy. Thank you so much, Professor Sopori, for this. As I said, this massive moment wouldn't have been possible but for the principal financial provisions made by particularly two institutions. One, the Public Diplomacy Division of Ministry of External Affairs, and secondly, the Indian Council of Social Science Research. And we made it a point that it is truly a congregation of IR scholars who would be put to comfort, not only in academic terms but also in physical terms. This wouldn't have been possible but for the financial support. I wouldn't say ample financial support, but we had to cut some edges in our budget. I would also take the opportunity of warmly thanking our partner institutions. 6 of them are universities, as our dean has mentioned: University of Pune, Central University of Hyderabad, University of Calcutta, Punjab University, Pondicherry University, and also Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis. So it is not only truly geographical terms Indian, but also I would say diverse in terms of state universities, central universities, and this partnership, I hope, will set a new trend in the Indian discourse in the field of Indian IR. Next is, I would say, a great word of sincere thanks to a variety of academic contributors, including, for example, the foreign delegates who have come to the convention not only to make presentations but also chair various sessions. Indian delegates, academics and non-academics, who have sent a large number of abstracts which were put to peer review process, as our Dean Professor Pant had mentioned. And I'm very happy to share with you the fact that about 50% of paper presenters are students, and about 50 of that 50% come from outside of JNU, SIS and Delhi. And this is truly gratifying moment, and I'm sure this is a signal for sound state of affairs in future, hopefully for Indian IR. Chairs and referees, distinguished colleagues, senior colleagues have agreed to come forward and help. Referees, a large number of referees have been approached to give their assessment of abstracts, and they did so in a time-bound fashion. Last but not the least is the community of organizers, both faculty and students. My faculty colleagues have been enthusiastic right from the outset, at the moment when we were debating whether to accept this offer of hosting, and also debating the exact formulation of the convention theme till today. There is a community of colleagues, collegial spirit that existed, whether in the form of the academic committee, logistical committee, finance committee, and aided ably by admirable efforts of the army of student volunteers. There are about 60 students who have worked day in and day out in various capacities, often foregoing their lunch and dinner, and perhaps also foregoing their academic responsibilities. I pay my sincere tribute to the selfless service provided by the students. I hope they will carry back home a great memorable experience. And in short, I would say, wish you all a great convention today and the 2 days that follow today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Murthy. And friends, thank you all for being here.